Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Today's show is brought to you by Audible. Audible is offering our listeners a free audiobook with a 30-day trial membership. Just go to audibletrial.com/aforkintime and browse the unmatched selection of audio programs. Download a title free and start listening right away. It's that easy. Go to audibletrial.com/aforkintime.
Welcome to today's episode of A Fork in Time. I'm Don Shelley, your host. For the episode today, we're actually going to dip back in to our archive of episodes that were originally made available to our patron supporters on Patreon. Give you a little sample of the type of bonus coverage that we provide there for those who are able to and are willing to provide a little additional support to the podcast. So today we're actually going to look at an episode that was recorded back in November of last year and give you a sample of what one of those might look like. Also, before we get rolling today, wanted to just remind you of a couple of things. In last week's episode, we talked about our new fiction focus, and so we certainly encourage you to check out our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com and check on the link there and provide us some feedback for our first of what will be an upcoming episode focusing particularly on an alternate history fiction writer. In this case, that's going to be one of the most prolific writers in the genre. That's going to be Harry Turtledove. And so if you didn't get a chance last week to listen to the show, we introduced the concept of fiction focus, and it's an opportunity for our listeners to provide us feedback and then for us to have a focused episode on a particular author. So in this case, we're looking for feedback from our fans and from our listeners on that particular author, which is Harry Turtledove. So if you go to our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com, or follow the link that's in the show notes, you'll be connected to where you can provide that feedback. Real easy to do, and we think this is going to be a new, interesting feature, add a new twist to what we do here on A Fork in Time. So after a brief word from one of the affiliates that we have here from the podcast, giving you a little information about something that may be of value to you and can be of value to us, we'll get to the episode. Thanks.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart, groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. I'm Don Shelley, your host. Once again, we thank you for joining us today on the podcast, where what we do is we go back and look at how history might have been different if it had taken a different road or a different fork from a particular event. Today we're going to hop back in the historical what-if machine, and we're going to head back to the late 5th century, and the place we're going is actually in Central Europe. Today on the podcast we're going to look at what might have happened if Attila the Hun had survived his wedding night, and how might that have influenced history moving forward from his death in 453 A.D. As we often do on the podcast, it's valuable to explore the historical what did so that we have the proper context and the setting for the historical what if. But also in this case, it's probably also a good idea for us to review a little bit about who Attila was. While certainly Attila the Hun is, I think, a known name to folks who are even not a student of history, even students of history may not be fully familiar with who the Huns were or particularly who Attila might be. And so it's important to sort of get the context or the setting because that'll help understand the historical what if as also, again, in conjunction with the historical what did, the actual timeline. So perhaps the first question that might be helpful to look at as background is actually who are these people that are known as the Huns. Well, the Huns were nomadic people. They had arisen out of Central Asia, the area of the Caucasus, what we think of today as being Eastern Europe, as far back as about 150 years before the events that we're talking about today in the middle of the 5th century. And they had lived originally in the area near the Volga River and had been predominantly moving west for the period of time leading up to the events that we're going to be talking about today. Again, they were a tribal people, sort of known as being nomadic and pastoral at the same time. So they had flocks, and they would settle down, and occasionally they would, of course, plant crops and do other things that were more in the area of being settled, but they were nomadic. And they were also known for their skill and capabilities as warriors. Particularly, they were known for their ability to effectively fight from horseback using bows and arrows, so mounted archery. Later, one of the other great growing empires that would arise up out of the Central Asian steppes would be those of the Mongols. And they shared some of the same characteristics in terms of their skills and the method by which they were able to undertake and be successful in war. For Attila and his brother actually rise to sort of being in the position of leadership for the collection of tribes for what essentially passed for the Hun Empire or the Hun peoples, and those were divided into both an eastern and a western half. And so Attila actually becomes the leader of the western half of the Huns, while his brother Bleda becomes the leader of the eastern half. Eventually, there's a conflict that arises between the two of them. Most historians agree that Attila murders Bleda to become the single ruler of the Huns. And as a result of that, the power and the influence of the Huns shifts a little bit west. Placing them on the map, though, it's sort of important to understand that they sort of are astride what we think of as being much of Europe today. And the Roman Empire had split into two halves, the Western Roman Empire, which was still centered in Rome, and the Eastern Roman Empire, which had been relocated to the capital in Constantinople. That had happened under Constantine. And so we have the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire, and the Huns were on the map above both of those, so covering an area from what we think of today as being in the areas that sort of border between France and Germany, but all the way across to the Black Sea and dominating the area of the Balkans. This is the area where the Huns are actually in control. They're a tribal confederation, but Attila is clearly their leader. Their tactic normally seems to be, while they're very successful in military efforts, is not necessarily that of conquering peoples, but undertaking military exploits, conquering land, and then extracting back tribute from those that they had conquered. So in many instances, they would go and actually take over lands, but then give the lands back in exchange for the payment of tribute. And this was something that Attila did well. And in fact, in two separate instances, he launched campaigns against the Western Roman Empire based in Rome, so launching an offensive into Italy, but also launching an offensive against Constantinople, and the Eastern Roman Empire through the Balkans and the area that we think of as being Greece and Turkey today. In both instances, he did not succeed in making it all the way to the Roman capital, but in both instances, he was able to gain a tremendous amount of land and gain a tremendous amount of tribute back from the Romans as a result of those particular invasions of the Roman empires. And so as we come to the events of 453 BC, which is when Attila is going to die, we find that the Huns exist as a very large, powerful military force north of the Roman empires and are having a great influence on what's going on inside of the Roman Empire, as also the rest of Europe as well. Now, of course, the Rome that we're talking about here is not the Rome of Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar and the height of Roman power, which has been several centuries before. This is the Roman Empire in decline. In fact, it will only be a few short years, depending on which date you choose to settle on, for the end of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in the West, most historians would agree, ends in 476 AD. So we're really less than 30 years away from the end of the western half of the Roman Empire. The eastern half of the empire would survive for a much longer period of time, eventually becoming the Byzantine Empire. But the Rome that exists at the time of Attila's death is a Roman Empire that's in the throes of its last days. It's having difficulty maintaining control in areas of North Africa, where they've been fighting with the Vandals and other forces there. They're having difficulty with being able to obtain enough food, and foodstuffs to be able to feed their population, and they're under threats and force from a lot of different areas and different regions. The Roman Empire has been shrinking, and with that shrinking, it's taking on more and more and more of the types of things that will eventually cause it to implode. Of course, one of the major forces that exist north of that are the Huns, and they're one of the forces that's been pushing down and putting pressure on the Roman Empire. So as we arrive at the date of Attila's death, we have a weakened Rome. Certainly the Western Empire considered to be in sort of its death throes, and eventually will fall within less than 30 years in 476. And we also have an Eastern Empire that, while it is stronger than its Western counterpart, is still under pressure as well. So this is where we find ourselves in March of 453, and this is where we're actually going to look at diverging the timelines, and that divergence is going to be around the events that happen on the night of Attila's wedding. Not his first wedding, but definitely his last. And so we'll pick up the story starting there. In 452, the year before Attila's death, Attila had been engaged in a campaign in Italy, where once again he had invaded Italy, renewing his pressure against the western half of the Roman Empire, and gained additional tribute. However, while undertaking that particular exercise, some of the eastern part of the Roman Empire had become less faithful in paying its honor in the form of ransom or in form of tribute to Attila in the years that he was focused on the western part of the empire. And so his plans in 453 were to once again take an offensive towards Constantinople to bring that particular part of the empire back into line after they had ceased to start paying tribute about 2 years before. However, before doing that in March, Attila decides to take another new wife. He had more than one. Some of these were political marriages. Others were marriages that essentially consolidated positions of conquest that he had undertaken. And so in March of 453, we find that he takes on a bride who is believed to be of Eastern Germanic descent, perhaps Gothic based upon her name, and her name is Ildiko. And Ildiko is married to the very young and beautiful Ildiko is married to Attila in a ceremony that happens in March of 453. The interesting thing about that is that while they go into the tent and take on the activities of consummating the marriage that night, what happens the next morning is that Attila's supporters and his royal guard find that he has actually died overnight in the tent. No one was there when it happened, the nature of it being his wedding night, and so there are a couple of different stories that have arisen regarding what happened. One is that he just had too much to drink and actually suffered something of a nosebleed, and because he was unconscious and on his back, he actually suffocated as a result of the nosebleed, and he dies from essentially natural causes or drunkenness and nothing that was foul play. However, there are later legends and some stories that are attributed to the fact that perhaps he may have actually been slain or something or poisoned by his young bride. We're not going to investigate or on this podcast look at what all the possibilities are regarding the death. We just want to say that he died on his wedding night under circumstances that were very sudden. And so suddenly what the situation is thrown into for the Huns is they have lost what essentially now is their sole leader. Remember, he'd already just deposed his brother and become essentially the sole king over the tribes, the Huns. And so this is a sudden event, whether it's the result of foul play as a result of his young wife or just natural causes or the result of drunkenness or something that happened that night, the nosebleed. Either way, there was no longer an Attila to lead the Huns. And that's going to create a vacuum. And that vacuum is going to create a problem, and it's going to create a couple of different things that will lead us down exploring the alternate history path. In the real timeline of history, there's not a clear successor. Essentially, a civil war breaks out inside of the Huns, and as a result, the Huns, while remaining in influence, are not the singular influence that they were under Attila and not united under Attila as they were before. And so in the real timeline of history, the Huns, while still having an influence and still being a people group that we will see throughout European history, they never quite rise to the same level of ascendancy that they did under Attila. And eventually other forces and eventually the Roman Empire will fall. And so Europe moves into the period of time where there's a great deal of tribal warfare, contesting the territorial areas that some had been there previously under Roman control or Roman influence. And it's not until the rise of the Frankish kingdoms, and eventually leading to Charlemagne, that we see some semblance of sort of order restored throughout much of Europe. That's the real timeline. However, we're going to explore the alternative timeline where we actually have Attila surviving his wedding night and seeing what would have happened potentially as a result of his survival. So as we begin to explore the alternate fork in time, the first thing that would be different if Attila had lived is really not a very difficult thing to imagine at all, because it was, as I mentioned before, was already planned for 453, and that was that Attila was going to lead the Hunnish forces once again on an invasion to put pressure on the Eastern Roman Empire. They had stopped paying tribute with the change of leadership there with a new emperor a couple of years before, and so Attila had planned to launch an invasion to once again exert dominance and influence over them and begin to have the tribute flowing back from them. So the first departure really is not much of doesn't require much of a leap of imagination, because it's what Attila had planned to do, which is to actually once again invade the Eastern Roman Empire. The most likely outcome there, again, would not have been him actually taking Constantinople, because it would have been difficult for him to seize Constantinople. And the primary reason for that is one of the great defensive benefits of Constantinople, later would become Byzantium, and of course we know as modern-day Istanbul, is how it sits there on the water on the Bosporus. And in order to be successful in taking Constantinople, one of the things that would have been required would have been a fleet. It's necessary to have both naval forces and ships to be able to successfully conquer or take the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. This is something that the Huns did not have. They were very skilled as far as infantry, mounted infantry in the terms of being cavalry on horses with archers, but they did not have the naval resources to be able to conquer Constantinople. So while an invasion would have been launched once again by the surviving Attila on the Eastern Roman Empire, the likely outcome would have been the similar outcome to before. A large portion of land would have been taken. They would have been brought back under a form of, through threat, a form of subjugation back under the Huns to the point that they would have been paying tribute to maintain their independence, and things would have sort of returned again, once again, to the status quo that had existed previous before the tribute had stopped flowing with the change of the emperor. In fact, one of the questions sometimes raised by historians thinking through what could have happened if Attila had survived is, would Attila have been able to take either of the Roman empires? And most conjecture is that he would not have been able to, for the very same reasons that he had been unsuccessful before, and that the Hunnish pattern had been simply that of exerting the pressure to obtain the tribute. One might argue Attila really didn't want to rule the Roman Empire. He just wanted to have the pleasure and the joy of enjoying the tribute that came from a secure and stable Roman Empire existing. That's true for both the West and the East. It can also very logically be argued that this was actually a benefit for Rome, given the situation that it was in as it was in decline. In that, yes, they were having to pay tribute and they were having to deal with an aggressive foreign influence to their north. I'll use the example here of the Western Roman Empire, but also true of the East, but particularly the Western Empire, because they were in more of a state of decline than the Eastern Empire. But it also meant that the Huns were also the one power that they were dealing with. And so they weren't having to deal with other tribal forces that were going to be disruptive or equally disruptive to the Huns. So in some sense, the Huns were keeping other tribal peoples in check in terms of advancing against the Roman Empire. So other elements that would later come to be, for example, the Goths, the Vandals, others as well, were somewhat kept in check by the existence of the Huns. And it was the benefit of the Huns to keep these other powers in check, because that made sure that nobody was going to be honing in or taking a portion of the tribute that was being paid to them. So this sort of uneasy balance came to exist between the Romans, yes, being paying tribute and being somewhat subjected to the Huns under the control of Attila, but at the same time, they were also benefited by the fact that they were dealing with only one party who was trying to do this particular thing to them. And so it tended to be a situation that, while they may not have thought of it as being a benefit, they would quickly discover after Attila's death and the circumstances that would occur over the next 20 to 25 years that it could be far worse than paying tribute to the Huns. And so one of the things that potentially is an outcome of the survival of Attila is actually the Roman Empire being able to last longer, particularly the Western Empire. Instead of falling in 476, it may have been able to stabilize some of the other things that were causing it to be unstable, and it may have been able to last for perhaps decades more, maybe a century more. It's tough to know exactly what would have happened. I think it's very unlikely that we would have seen the Roman Empire subjugated, becoming under the control of Attila, but we might have seen the Roman Empire to some degree becoming a client state to this Hunnish Empire, we'll call it Hunnia, that has been created, that exists there in Central Europe and moving over into Eastern Europe. But the Roman Empire, as it had existed with emperors, perhaps even those emperors being chosen or somewhat dictated by Attila, by being those who were willing to pay the tribute versus those who were perhaps not willing to pay the tribute or be more of in revolt to the idea of paying the tribute, could have survived much longer. And so one of the potential outcomes of Attila surviving his wedding night is not only the survival of the influence of the Huns and of the Hun Empire, but also the continuation of the Western Roman Empire. In the real-time line of history, the dominance of the Huns, or if you will, the Hunnic Empire, only lasts for about 80 years after Attila's death. The infighting, the civil war that erupts between his sons over successorship, eventually leads to them becoming far less of an influence in the space of less than a century. And in fact, during that period of time, of course, we have the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and we have this period of barbarism and confusion that sets in for most of Western Europe and for South Central Europe as a result of the Huns' influence being diminished, the fall of the Western Roman Empire, and the things that follow from that. That eventually in the real-time line will sort of come to coalesce and be corrected when we have the rise of Clovis and the Frankish Empire. And so one of the interesting attributes of Attila surviving is the impact on potentially all the way down to our present day on what we think of as being France. Because for the period of time, initially with Clovis rising as the Frankish Empire, and then certainly during the period of Charlemagne, where we have that empire rising to ascendancy, the creation of the Holy Roman Empire in the areas that we think of as being Western Europe today, then we would have a very different outcome if you had the Huns survive as a power. The power vacuum that is created as a result of their demise and the demise of the Western Roman Empire is what eventually allows the rise of what becomes France. And so in a scenario where Attila survives his wedding night and is able to create a sustained or a sustainable Hunnish Empire that can succeed for a period of time beyond that 80 years most likely, is that you have a stabilizing force in Central and Southern Europe and also Eastern Europe there as well that is the Huns. And thus, eventually what we would have later, most likely in European history, is more of the area that we think of as being Germany today rising out of the survival of that Hunnic Empire, also certainly having an influence over in the areas of the Balkans as well. And the Frankish kingdoms and the Frankish tribes would have been contained much more to the northern part of Europe, instead of being able to come and gather a large portion of the central area of Europe and becoming what we eventually know later as modern-day France. So one of the other potential outcomes or changes would be a more centralized, if you will, unified Germany with different origins that would occupy most of what we know today of as being Austria, perhaps the area, parts of Poland. So you would have had this Germania that would arise out of the survival of Attila and a more sustainable rule by the Huns at the expense of France. And so the powers in Europe and how things would have progressed out from that point forward is a little bit difficult to understand. It's very likely that the Huns would have become also Christianized over a period of time. And so we would have seen many of the events of European history be very similar with respect to the church and to the state in Europe, but you wouldn't have a situation where it's not until the late 19th century when Germany is being united under Bismarck from a collection of disparate German principalities. You may have had more of a unified Germanic peoples, a unified Germanic state that comes out of or inherits its source from the Hun Empire, or the Hunnic Empire that existed. And so you may have had Germany act much more like France historically in terms of being a larger, more unified, coherent territory and people group throughout the 1,000 years of history that precedes the modern times there that we find today. And so one of the unique attributes of a survival of Attila is actually on what would have happened with France and what would have happened with Germany. Finally, the last thing to think about is how things might have been different sort of overall, I think, potentially for the church. One of the interesting things to think about is that the church eventually, the Catholic Church here, owing its allegiance to various political rulers throughout European history, and of course the rise of the Holy Roman Empire, might have been different if they had been or become part of or an extension of the tradition that would have come down through the Huns. So one of the questions that arises is, would we have seen a shift in the location of what was central to the Catholic Church, moving more into mainstream Europe, perhaps having Germany perhaps more of its protector? This is highly speculative. It's tough to know exactly what would have happened, but again, understanding that there would have been a different set of influences politically in Europe and the role that the church and politics played back and forth throughout the history of Europe would have definitely been changed as a result of who the dominant powers were. For example, in later times, as Spain is on the ascendancy and eventually becomes the Catholic Church's strongest defender, would that have been different if there had been a stronger Germany in place? If you don't have the influence of France, would England, for example, been able to arise and exert more influence on the continent? And so many of the things that we've talked about in other podcast episodes, where you have not just British interests confined, particularly even after the Norman invasion, confined to just Britain, but also having more influence on the continent because you don't have a France that exists the same way. You might even also argue that there may not have been a Norman invasion of France, a Norman invasion of England, if you don't have France play out the way that it does after the rise of Charlemagne's empire. And so, again, as always is the case here on The Fork in Time, as we move further down the historical timeline, it's tough to know what these small diversions could have eventually led to, but you may have had a very different Britain. You may have had a very different, obviously, France, different parts of Eastern Europe, because they would have been under more of a unified influence under perhaps this extended, having its origin with the Huns, I'll just call it German influence or German territory that would have flowed from that. So again, the small ripple, the fork in time, can lead to pretty wide dispersion as you get further down the timeline. Again, thank you for joining us today on A Fork in Time. Hope you've enjoyed this little brief excursion into what would have happened if one of the more well-known by name figures in history had actually managed to survive his wedding night and not had a nosebleed or a poisoning, depending on what your point of view is. But if Attila the Hun had survived to be an influence for years beyond 453, and how things might have been different. Once again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time and appreciate your patronage and you being a part of our listening audience in our community. And until next time, have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.